I only noticed the second hotel receipt because it was folded inside the first one, and both had the therapist's signature at the bottom. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I realized it was the same hotel, same room number, same date pattern, always after their therapy sessions. And that's when I understood something in my marriage had been quietly engineered, not healed. I had been married long enough to stop noticing the silence between us. We weren't fighting anymore. That was the strained part. Every Thursday evening at exactly 19:15, we walked into the same beige waiting room on the third floor. The clock on the wall always read 2 minutes slow. My wife sat with her hands folded in her lap, coat still buttoned. I stared at the faded carpet until the therapist opened the door at 19:30 sharp. He never rushed us. Calm voice, measured pauses. He spoke like someone who had already heard every version of every story and still chose to listen. At first, I hated the sessions. The way he nodded when she spoke. The way he waited for me to fill the gaps. But after 6 weeks, something shifted. My wife stopped reacting defensively during our drives home. She no longer tightened her jaw when I mentioned money or weekends. She simply agreed. Too much. One night we left the building at 20:47. Rain had started while we were inside. She walked ahead of me toward the car, shoulders relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. Under the streetlight, her face looked almost peaceful. I caught myself thinking she was finally getting better, or she was just disappearing. The next Thursday, she arrived at the office 10 minutes early. I found her already seated when I walked in at 19:12. She had taken a chair closer to the therapist's desk. Her posture was straighter. When he asked how the week had been, she answered without hesitation, voice even and low. I watched her hands. They no longer fidgeted with her wedding ring. After the session ended at 20:45, we drove home in the usual quiet. At 21:23, she went straight to the bathroom and stayed there longer than usual. I stood in the kitchen, pouring water I didn't want, listening to the faucet run. When she came out, her eyes were clear. No redness. No trace of anything. She smiled at me once, small and brief, before heading upstairs. That smile stayed with me until 23:40 when I finally turned off the light. The following week, she suggested we change our seats in the therapist's office. She wanted to sit on the couch instead of the chairs. The therapist agreed without comment. During the hour, she leaned slightly toward him when he spoke. Not much. Just enough that I noticed. I kept counting the minutes until the session ended. On the drive back, she rested her head against the window and closed her eyes. The street lights moved across her face in slow yellow stripes. At one red light, I glanced over and realized her breathing had become perfectly steady. Too steady. I never asked what they talked about when I stepped out for water that evening. I never asked why the therapist's notes now included pages she seemed to recognize before he even opened them. Some questions felt safer left unopened. But the silence between us had changed shape. It was no longer empty. It was listening. I noticed it first on a Tuesday evening at 21:12. My wife stood by the kitchen counter, pouring tea she rarely drank. She mentioned something about our weekend plans and the words came out clean, precise. We should establish clearer emotional regulation this time. The phrase landed like a foreign coin. I had heard it only 40 minutes earlier, spoken in the therapist's low, even tone during the session. She used it again 2 days later while folding laundry at 19:55. Safe communication boundaries matter more than we realize. Same cadence. Same slight pause before the key words. Not her rhythm. His. At first I told myself it was progress. People pick up language in therapy. It happens. But she stopped saying what she actually felt. Everything passed through a filter now. When I found her sitting on the edge of the bed at 22:37, staring at nothing, I asked if she was okay. She turned her head slowly and answered without blinking. I'm working on my attachment response patterns. It takes time to rewire. Her voice sounded borrowed. One Thursday we left the office at 20:52. Rain again. She walked to the car with her coat unbuttoned despite the cold. In the passenger seat, she kept her hands perfectly still on her thighs. At the first stoplight, I glanced across and saw her lips moving silently, repeating something under her breath. I didn't ask what. The next session ran longer than usual. The therapist suggested I step out for 5 minutes so he could speak with her alone about individual calibration. I waited in the beige hallway, counting the tiles on the floor. When I returned at 20:41, she was sitting straighter, shoulders squared in a way that looked practiced. Her eyes met mine with calm detachment. She smiled the same small smile from the week before. On the drive home, the car felt smaller. At 21:18, she said, without turning her head, "Stability is the foundation. Once that's solid, everything else follows." Not her sentence. His sentence. I kept both hands on the wheel and watched the road ahead. The streetlights passed in regular intervals, cutting across her face. Each time the light hit, her expression stayed exactly the same. The unease that had started as a quiet itch was spreading now, slow and deliberate. Because the therapist wasn't simply repeating techniques in our joint sessions anymore. He was installing something. And she was starting to run it perfectly. By the sixth session, the dynamic in our marriage had shifted completely. My wife became easier, almost too perfect. She moved through the house at 7:40 each morning without a single sharp edge. Breakfast was quiet and efficient. No resistance when I suggested changes to the schedule. No emotional spikes, just calm compliance. And somehow I had become the problem. The therapist began redirecting every conversation toward my reactions. He leaned forward slightly in his chair at 19:52 and noted how my tone affected the space between us. How my need for clarity might be making her withdraw. Session after session, the focus narrowed until the hour felt like an examination of me. We left the office together at 20:48. She walked beside me to the car, posture relaxed, breathing even. But once home, she never processed the session with me. The emotional work seemed already finished somewhere else. Instead, she started taking longer after-session decompression walks. Alone. Every Thursday. She left at 21:05 exactly, coat on, phone in hand, and headed the same direction down the street toward the park. She returned at 21:47, cheeks slightly flushed from the cold hair neat. I watched the clock each time. One night at 22:13, she plugged her phone into the charger on the kitchen counter while I stood at the sink. The screen lit up with a notification preview. The message was short and clear. "Same time next week at the hotel works for me." Hotel. Not the office. Not the clinic. Hotel. She noticed me looking and froze for half a second. Then she picked up the phone, turned it face down, and continued as if nothing had happened. The next morning at 8:15, I checked while she was in the shower. The message thread no longer existed. Deleted. But the preview had already burned itself into my mind. There was no booking system. No clinic calendar. Only private messages exchanged at odd hours. I sat on the edge of the bed at 23:40 that night and listened to her steady breathing beside me. She slept without stirring. The unease had moved deeper now. It no longer scratched at the surface. Because I had seen the notification. I had seen the deletion. I had seen the calm way she lied without speaking. But I still hadn't seen the receipts. And something told me those would be worse. The discovery didn't happen in a dramatic confrontation. It happened on laundry day at 9:17. I emptied the pockets of her gray jacket the way I always did. My fingers closed around two folded receipts. Same hotel. Same room number, 412. Same timestamps, both ending well after our Thursday sessions finished. One at 22:35. The other at 22:41 the following week. But it wasn't the hotel that stopped my hands. It was the handwritten note at the bottom of each receipt. For continuation of care. Care, not stay. Not meeting. Care. And both receipts carried the therapist's signature in the same controlled script. I stood at the washing machine with the receipts flat on my palm until 9:24. The dryer hummed behind me. I folded the papers exactly as I had found them and slipped them back into the left inside pocket. The entire structure of our marriage tilted in that quiet moment. The therapy sessions no longer looked like healing. They looked like coordination. Weekly alignment. Private calibration. I kept moving through the morning. At 10:05 I made coffee I didn't drink. At 11:30 I watched her leave for work with the same even steps, jacket buttoned neatly. She never checked the pockets. That evening she returned at 18:47 and went straight upstairs to change. I listened to the sound of the jacket being hung in the closet. No pause. No search. Nothing. The worst part came when I studied the dates again later that night at 23:12. Both extra sessions had happened on Thursdays. Both had lasted nearly 2 hours after we supposedly left the office together, and both receipts listed 2 names under participants. Mine wasn't one of them. I wasn't just being sidelined. I was being managed. I sat on the edge of the bed at 08 while she slept beside me, breathing steady and slow. The receipts were back where I had found them. Everything looked untouched, but the pattern was clear now. The hotel wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a one-time slip. It was routine. And the real twist wasn't the room or the signatures or even the word care. It was what those extra sessions were actually doing to both of us, and how perfectly she was learning to hide it. I went back through everything that night at 1:20. Messages, old calendars, session notes I had scribbled on the back of receipts. The pattern locked into place with mechanical precision. Every Thursday, my wife left the office calmer, movement smoother, voice flatter. In the same week, I grew sharper, more restless, more likely to press for answers she no longer gave. It wasn't healing. It was imbalance creation. The therapist had guided every shift. When she became steadier, he spent more minutes on my reactions. When she stopped arguing, he highlighted how my tone disrupted the new equilibrium. The scales tipped deliberately, week after week. I waited until the following Thursday at 20:50, right after we left the building. In the car, I turned to her and laid out the hotel receipts, the deleted messages, the timestamps. She didn't flinch or deny anything right away. She simply looked tired. Not guilty, just tired, as if the conversation itself required effort she no longer wanted to spare. Later that night at 23:15, she spoke without being pressed again. Her words came out measured and flat. He had told her this was part of the process. That one of us had to stabilize first so the other could follow. The sentence sat between us like cold metal. That wasn't therapy language. That was conditioning language. We weren't being treated together. We were being separated psychologically, on purpose. The calm she gained came at the direct cost of my growing unease. The therapist controlled the pace, deciding who steadied and who fractured. The next session I arrived early at 19:08. The inner door was slightly ajar. I stood in the hallway and listened. The therapist spoke softly on the other side, voice low and deliberate. He said both partners reaching equilibrium at the same time meant control was lost. Emotional dependency had to be staggered. Control, dependency. Staggered healing. It wasn't therapy. It was orchestration. I stepped back before they noticed me and waited until 19:30 to knock as usual. Inside the room, my wife sat with perfect posture. The therapist greeted me with the same calm nod he always used. Nothing in his face suggested he had just spoken about managing us like separate instruments. That evening after the session ended at 20:55, I didn't drive straight home. I followed her. She left the building at 21:02 and turned left instead of toward the car. I kept distance, staying on the opposite side of the street. At 21:14, she entered the side entrance of the same hotel. Room 412. I stood across the road at 21:17 watching the 4th floor window light up. The endgame was still hidden, but the shape was becoming clearer. Because the real question wasn't why he was meeting her alone after every session. It was what they were actually building together while I was being slowly unbalanced on purpose. And how much further the staggering was meant to go. She didn't go home. She went straight to the hotel at 21:14, coat still buttoned from the session. I watched from across the street as she entered the side door without slowing down. Same confident stride she once used only at work. Routine. Practiced. My hands shook as I crossed the road at 21:17. The lobby was quiet. I took the stairs instead of the elevator and moved down the 4th floor corridor until I reached room 412. The door stood slightly ajar. Inside, they sat across from each other at a small round table. No notebooks, no couch, no tissues. Just 2 glasses of water and a single lamp casting hard shadows. They weren't speaking like patient and therapist. They were coordinating. My wife listed dates and observed changes in my behavior with clinical detachment. The therapist nodded once, then added a correction about timing. Their voices stayed low and efficient, like 2 technicians reviewing test results. I pushed the door open at 21:23. The therapist didn't flinch. He looked up with the same calm expression he wore every Thursday at 19:30. Expectant. As if this exact entrance had been scheduled weeks ago. My wife stood immediately. The therapist raised one hand without rising from his chair. He spoke quietly, telling her not to react. This was the final phase. The words landed with mechanical weight. My chest tightened as the pieces locked together. The staggered dependency. The deliberate imbalance. The hotel receipts marked continuation of care. None of it had been about saving the marriage. It had been about steering its outcome. He looked at me directly across the table and stated that we had both reached the necessary dependency thresholds. Now the resolution could be decided. Decided. Not discussed. Not healed. Decided. I stood there while the lamp hummed faintly above us. My wife remained standing, hands at her sides, breathing steady. The therapist leaned back slightly, fingers resting on the edge of the table, watching my face with professional interest. We were never patients. We were subjects. The entire 6 months of weekly sessions at 1930, the careful language implantation, the private calibrations in room 412, it had all been one long, controlled experiment disguised as marriage counseling. And the worst part was how cleanly it had worked. Because even now, standing in that hotel room at 2126, I could feel the imbalance he had engineered still pulling at me, while she stood perfectly composed on the other side of the table. The final phase had begun. But I still didn't know what resolution they had already chosen for us. What followed wasn't chaos. It was dismantling. I spent the next 3 days at 2:40 each morning going through public records and anonymous forums. The therapist's practice had been under multiple investigations for 14 months. Anonymous complaints, pattern anomalies in session notes, inconsistent billing records that never quite matched the official calendar. We weren't the first couple. Just the most recent cycle in a quiet rotating experiment. My wife left therapy the following Thursday at 19:15 without explanation. She simply didn't get out of the car when we reached the building. I turned the engine off at 19:22 and sat with her in silence for 11 minutes. Then I drove away. I never went back either. But the damage wasn't only to trust, it was to perception. We moved through the house differently now. At 8:05 each morning, she prepared coffee with the same precise movements. Yet her eyes tracked me a fraction longer than before. I caught myself pausing at 22:50 when she spoke, searching for borrowed phrasing that no longer appeared. The silence between us had changed texture. It carried weight. Every calm sentence from her felt like an echo of something engineered. And the worst part, it had worked. Just not in the way it was supposed to. The staggered dependency had taken root too deeply. She had learned perfect stability while I had been sharpened into permanent vigilance. We could both see it now. How easily our reactions had been isolated, measured, and adjusted like separate dials. How one could be steadied while the other was deliberately unsettled. How the therapist had orchestrated the imbalance until the marriage itself became secondary to the control. At 23:37 one night I found her standing by the window, staring at the street below. She didn't turn when I entered the room. Her posture remained straight, shoulders level. I stopped 3 steps behind her and watched the reflection of her face in the dark glass. Neither of us spoke. We had both been redirected for months without noticing the hands on the controls. Now the hands were gone, but the redirection remained. We could function together, yet every interaction carried the faint imprint of external calibration. The experiment had ended. But the separation it created between who we once were and who we had quietly become kept stretching wider each quiet evening. And neither of us knew yet how far it would pull us apart. People think manipulation always looks like lies. But sometimes it looks like structure, routine, authority, and calm voices saying all the right therapeutic words. What I learned wasn't just about my marriage. It was about how trust can be engineered slowly enough that you don't recognize the design until you're already inside it. And by then, you're not asking whether it's real anymore. You're asking who decided it for you.